All right, so let's talk about social interactions. Before we talk about the supports for social skills, it's again important to kind of think about, well, what are the challenges that a lot of the individuals we support, what do they experience, right? So if you think again about social interactions, this requires really fluent communication skills. You need to be a good communicator to engage in social interactions well, right? So that means processing speech, spoken language, quickly, especially if you're here and I'm the one talking. You have to respond to lots of different cues. So not just the words that are being said, but things like intonation and facial expression, because all of that also carries meaning. Those are things that people with autism have lots of difficulty with. Is this a sarcastic comment? Is this a joking comment? I don't know. Is the person mad? Is the person happy? I'm not sure. The ability to pay attention to multiple speakers. In lots of social situations, it's usually not just one-on-one, but it's socializing with a group of people, and you know how in groups, during breaks, lots of people are talking at the same time and you're listening in and you're shifting from one person to another. That's a requirement for social interaction. You have to be able to respond to other people appropriately, but you also need to be able to initiate appropriately. And this means at the right time. And I don't know if any of you know adults on the autism spectrum in particular who are pretty high functioning. They're pretty capable individuals, but they seem to have difficulty in social conversations with that, because it's just like this millisecond pause that we know is then our turn to say something, and people with autism often seem like they're just kind of half a pause behind, and they end up interrupting, right? I've had conversations with friends of mine who have autism, and we've talked about this, and they're like, I can't quite tell. I know that you guys know, but I can never figure out when it's time for me to say, and I end up not saying what I should say, or I interrupt, or whatever. So it's this timing issue that a lot of people with autism experience. Staying on topic, right? Again, if you think about all of this conversation stuff is really challenging, and you want me to talk about something that I'm either not interested in or know nothing about, I don't think so, right? So if I have to talk about all of this stuff that's really difficult, at least we're going to talk about something that I know about, that I'm comfortable talking about. So it's often difficult for people to stay on topic. They try to shift the topic back to what they know about or what they're comfortable talking about. And then you have to follow these kinds of societal conventions and expectations, that whole eye contact thing, right? I have a friend with autism, and he says to me, I can do one of two things. This is what he says to most people when he meets them. I can look at you, or I can listen to you. You pick. Right? It's like, point well taken, right? If he knows you really well, he can make eye contact, right? He also knows the tricks. He's like, well, if they're really being finicky about the eye contact thing, I just look at their forehead. Right? They're happy. They think I'm looking at their eyes. I'm not. But whatever. Everybody's happy. Right? But these are the kinds of things. We've got all of these conventions that we get a little bit hung up on that can often make social interactions really challenging for people on the spectrum in particular. Right? So we're not making it easy for them to begin with. And they're already kind of behind the 8 ball. So ease up a little bit, first of all, is usually what I say. Let's just be fair about this. But people with autism talk about the challenges they have with these things quite often. If you listen to adults with autism who have the ability to tell us about the challenges they experience, they routinely talk about these kinds of things. And these are the individuals who have the skills and ability to convey that. Imagine what it's like for the individuals who are more challenged, right? So for lots of our individuals, they're even more challenged, and we're expecting typical conversation from them without providing them a lot of support to do so. So think about that, right? Certainly visual supports can help with some of the conversation. Right? So we can provide information visually that alerts people to what the topic is, helping them to stay on topic, right? We can use visuals to help them understand what other people are talking about, or to express themselves. We can also use visuals to help them learn the rules, because yes, indeed, there are these societal rules, right? Some of them will kind of say that's a stupid rule, and like I can look at you or I can listen to you, you choose, I'm not doing both, right? Or at other times we have to kind of follow the rule if we want to be able to participate in environments, right? I mean, it should be a 50-50 street, and I try to make it a 50-50 street as much as possible, but not everybody out in the world does, and so we do have to teach social rules and expectations. So if we can use some visual supports to help people understand what those rules are so that they can try not to break those rules, or if people are upset, they know why people are upset, because that's the other thing a lot of times in social conversation kinds of things. They might do or say something that other people deem inappropriate, and they don't know what they've done. And they don't know why everybody else is upset, right? So we can use visuals to help them understand those kinds of things, and then to help them learn how to avoid that in the future, okay? So our goal really, again, is about providing information. We're gonna provide different information this time than when we were talking about visual schedules this morning, but still providing information and supporting people in expressing themselves more clearly. So we're gonna talk about a whole bunch of strategies around supporting social skills and behaviors. We're gonna talk about social narratives. We're gonna talk about video modeling a little bit, and I'm gonna point in the direction of some video modeling resources. We're gonna talk about contingency maps. We're gonna talk about visuals for conveying rules, visuals to support choice making. We're gonna talk about environmental bridges, helping people communicate about things that happen in one environment in a different environment, like talking at home about what happened at school. And we're also gonna be talking about AAC supports, augmentative and alternative communication supports. Most of that's gonna happen tomorrow. We're gonna do a lot tomorrow. We've done this so far, and we have this much left to go. So social narratives, that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. Social narratives, these are story-based interventions. How many of you have heard of social stories? Social stories are one kind of social narrative, okay? So social narratives provide descriptions. Social narratives are all about describing social situations, highlighting the important cues, explaining thoughts and feelings of other people, with the thought that if the person has better understanding, they may behave differently, okay? So it's important to know that, particularly for social stories, and social stories is a strategy developed by Carol Gray, her goal was never to change behavior. That was a secondary outcome. Her primary outcome was to improve social understanding, right? And it makes sense. If we help people in terms of their social understanding and they understand better what's going on socially, their behavior is likely to change, but the strategy isn't about targeting the behavior. The strategy is about targeting the social understanding that seems to be missing, okay? So social stories also have been identified as an evidence-based practice for individuals from preschool through high school. So that's what the research literature has shown. Again, that does not mean don't use social narratives with someone who's 20 because they're no longer in high school. It just means we don't have enough research to support it yet. But if you try a social narrative and it's effective for an individual who's 20, carry on, right? Like, big deal. So social stories, here's the social story book. That's one specific type of social narrative, and you see trademark because social stories, that's a trademarked term, and there is a particular way that you're supposed to write a social story if indeed it is a social story. Out in the common vernacular, people have just started talking about any story as a social story, right? If I write any story, thou shalt not hit your peers, right? They'll call that a social story. It makes Carol Gray cringe and roll over and freak out and do all kinds of things because that's not a social story, right? That's a thou shall not list. That's not the intention of social stories. So social stories, trademarked, a la Carol Gray, have some very specific guidelines about how they're composed. Power cards, that's another specific type of social narrative. Both of these are the primary bodies of research, right? So the research that's been done to show social narratives are evidence-based. That research has been mostly around social stories and power cards, right? So these are two good programs to go and learn more about if you're wanting to write social narratives. So I've got a couple of social narratives just to show you as an example. This is from a research study a while back, but for a child who interrupted adults. And so the story kind of goes, adults like to talk. I mean, it's something that all children learn eventually. Sometimes they talk to each other, sometimes they talk to my brother, sometimes they talk on the phone, sometimes they talk to me. When adults are talking to someone else, I can probably watch a video, listen to a book tape, again 2002, tapes, right, book tapes, look at a book or play a quiet game. When I want to talk, I will wait my turn. If they do not see me, I can raise my hand or quietly say, "Excuse me, please." Then they will listen to me. I don't have to yell or hit. I will remember to wait my turn by thinking about my ant book. The ants go marching one by one. People talk one by one, right? So they took something that the kid, right? It's meaningful. I like when my wait is over and it is my turn. I like when people listen. So you already know from the story what this kid's problem was, right? Same kid, different problem. Oh, still waiting. Different kind of waiting. Sometimes I have to wait. Sometimes I wait to watch a video. Sometimes I wait to go to granddaddy's. I wait for my brother to take a turn. I wait in line at school. Sometimes I wait my turn to talk. When I have to wait, we make a list of things to do. Then I know how long I will need to wait. Sometimes we use the clock. I can tell when it is time. I am excited when I waited quietly and the wait is over, right? So it's information. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. It's information with a little bit of do, okay? This is a power card. So power cards are a bit different in that they're kind of social story-esque. They don't follow Carol Gray's protocol at all. But what they do is they take a student's particular interest and embed that interest into the story. So let me read you the story. Kazuki Takahashi initiates conversations that focus on others' interests. Do we know already what skill it is we're trying to address with this learner? Absolutely. Kazuki Takahashi is interested in other people and has learned to talk about things they like. He knows that people like to hear their name, so whenever he greets them, he says their name and looks them in the eye. He usually makes a point of finding out and remembering what their special interest or hobby is so that he can bring it up in conversation. If the person does not seem very talkative, he will ask a question about their interest and then listen carefully to the reply. Mr. Takahashi will use a keyword from the person's reply to make a positive comment. Kazuki Takahashi knows that people like to talk about their interests. He wants you to use the 4 steps that will help you have good conversations. Greet the person by name and look them in the eye. Ask about their interest and wait for response. Ask a question about their interest and listen for a keyword in their reply. Comment on the interest using the keyword. Put this strategy to use and find out Kazuki's secret to enjoying conversations. Right? So you kind of see how this goes, right? So this was an individual who's interested in this particular comic book artist. So that's the scenario. And then the card that people can carry around with them is a card with essentially those 4 points, okay? So those are the kind of 2 primary social narrative interventions that we have the most research on that are really quite useful. The important point about this is remembering that we're talking about information, not about a list of rules. This isn't a to-do list, right? This is about, let me explain something to you that you don't seem to understand about the social way of this context of this situation, right? Let me provide information to you. The other thing that's really important in terms of any kind of story intervention is that the language level is matched to the student. So if you're working with a student who doesn't have much language, none of these stories that I read to you are going to be particularly effective because they're too language laden. Certainly the power card one, not going to work with somebody who's like really challenged in terms of their language understanding. You can write social stories using graphics and very simple text. I've made social stories for students I've worked with who are deaf and have developmental disabilities and have extremely limited language, where the social story is kind of mostly picture, right? So you can do that, but social narratives may not be the best intervention for those individuals, right? Because they do rely on some language, right? Video modeling, for example, might be more appropriate for a kid who doesn't have as much language. Other strategies might be more appropriate. So this is not a social stories are the best approach for every student, or power cards are the best approach for every student. This is really about understanding what's a good match for your student, okay? You can do social narratives on tablets, and again, this is where I use my Pictello app very often. So with Pictello, you can create stories. You can have multiple stories that you make in the app. The really nice thing about this, what I love the most, is that if I'm making a social story or some sort of narrative on Pictello for a client of mine, I can make it at home on my iPad, upload it to the Pictello. They've got a little like special server thing, and then it sends a code to the family, and the family can use the download code to download to their child's device. So I don't have to go and take the kid's device to put the story on or sit in the family's home to make the story. I can make the story at home and send it to the family, right? In Pictello, you can get audio output. So the app will read the story to the individual if they're not a reader. And in Pictello, you can also embed video. So I've made some social narratives where there's lots of story with pictures, but then I'll also have a page that has a video clip demonstrating the target social behavior. So I kind of blend social narratives with video modeling all in one thing. So with Pictello, you can do that, right? So I can have blah, 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 here's what you do, and now here's the clip of kids playing on the playground doing what I just suggested in the story. Does that make sense? Yeah, so I like that feature of Pictello. In terms of implementing social narratives, here are the things that you have to do. First, you have to know what the situation is you want to target. Ideally, get some baseline data so you know whether or not your social story is effective. You don't want to do an intervention like a social story or a social narrative for months if it's not working. So if you can gather some data on a target behavior you're hoping will improve, that's great. Right? If you're a family and you're working with a consultant who can help you with that, that's a great thing. Choose a type of social narrative. Mostly, right, social story or power cards. Those are the ones that have the most research behind them. Both of them have kind of rules and guidelines. So you need to get the book, right? If you want to learn about power cards, get the power cards book, learn how to write it. Or get the social stories book, learn how to write them. And then write your social narrative, right? So the published resources that are out there, like the books, will help you. Autism internet modules, write this down because you guys are going to love this. If you go home and Google autism internet modules, and if you put it all together, autism internet modules, I'm pretty sure it's a .org. There are, I don't know how many modules, but loads of modules, all on evidence-based practices that, so you pick the social narrative evidence-based practice, you go through that module, it tells you how to make social narratives, it gives you examples of social narratives. At the end, there's a little quiz if you want to quiz yourself on how much you learned. Some of the modules have video examples. They have a checklist of all of the steps for that practice. So there are many, many, many modules. There's a module on discrete trial teaching. There's a module on functional communication training. There's modules on umpteen things, right? And they have a module on social narratives. So check that out because they're free. Free, 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 and excellent resources. So use that kind of resource, right? Whether published books or online, good quality online resources to help you write your social narrative. Figure out how you're going to display your social narrative. Do you need a lot of illustrations and less text? More text, few illustrations. That's going to depend on your individual, their language level, their reading level. Think about that kind of stuff. If you've got a person who doesn't see very well, the size of the font is going to be important. All of that kind of stuff. Once it's written, when you've written the social narrative, it's not enough. The intervention is not just, hey, I have a story for you, here it is, read it. That's not how we implement, right? Read before the target situation. Read it as much as you possibly can, right? But the general recommendation is at least every time before the target situation happens. But if you can read it more, that's great. Read it often, read it with the individual, right? It's also often good to ask a few comprehension questions at the end of the reading to make sure that the person understood. And if they can't answer the questions, you go back and you read that section of the story. Right? So some of the research studies that have looked at social stories, that's what they've done. They've added in a page at the end with a couple of key comprehension questions, right, as a way of checking. So when you're introducing the social narrative, it's really a good idea to do this in a place where there aren't a lot of distractions. So when you're going to read the social story the first few times, don't do it in the school hallway when like kids are moving around, and right, because your learner's not going to be able to pay attention. If the person can read for himself, have him read it. But if not, read it out loud to the person. Review the key concepts. So have pre-planned comprehension questions or ask some comprehension questions off the cuff. And sometimes even doing some role play is helpful, right? That's not a traditional part of social narratives, but it is something that we know about teaching new behaviors. Behavioral rehearsal or practice is an important thing. So we could read the social narrative and now let's role play what the social narrative said. And now let's go into the real situation and do that. And then provide prompts when necessary. So in the real situation, remember the story said, right? So provide prompts, provide reinforcement. Hey, great job. You remembered on the playground to do blah, 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 blah. Your friends really liked that. You see, he smiled. That means he was happy that you waited for him to have a turn, right? So reinforcement. And ideally, you're collecting data to see if behavior is improving. Because remember, the social story isn't designed to target the behavior specifically, but we're hoping that that behavior is going to change. So if we take some data before we do the story and we take some data afterwards and we see that there's an improvement, then keep using the story. If nothing's improving, don't keep doing the same thing that isn't working, right? Don't waste your time on stuff that isn't helping, okay?